Okay, I'm pretty sure that's done it.
Yep,
Okay,
this meeting is being recorded.
okay. Folks, this is Tom Burkhalter here with Andrew Wareham. And Andrew is a quite a well published, prolific historical fiction writer. I've just been reading his War to End All Wars series, and I'm here to tell you that it's well researched and well written. So, Andrew, welcome. I'm looking forward to speaking with you today.
Glad to meet you, Tom.
Tell me a little bit about why you started to write. What made you decide to write?
I finally got up the courage after perhaps 50 years of wanting to write. I finally decided I could do it, and funnily enough, I could.
Well, it is just a moment, isn't it? One day you just decide, okay, I
That's
can
all.
do this. Yeah,
One
okay.
day, suddenly, the story is there and it needs to be told. And I suddenly decided I could tell it.
How many books have you written so far, Andrew?
I published number 109 yesterday.
Well, now that goes along with what you told me about writing 10 hours a day. Holy Hannah. I can only dream about that level of productivity. I'm pretty much in awe here. So if you're writing 10 hours a day, and I can tell from War to End All Wars that you have a very high level of historical accuracy. How do you do research? I mean, I'm sure you must have had a fairly good education and probably an interest in history.
Started off, I took a degree in social sciences an awful lot of years ago, and that included a lot of economic history, which I loved. And I never let go of the economic history. There was always a book to hand. I was always writing when I traveled, talk to people, listen. And that's more important than talking, I suspect. And memorizing. I've got a good memory, and I can remember some conversations I had 60 years ago still, which is useful. And it's just a question of loving history and wanting to interpret history in my way. From actual research, the internet has made research so much easier. So I've normally got one computer I'm typing onto, another one open beside me, in which I am at regular intervals checking, is that right? Or can I say it's right, perhaps more importantly? And if nobody can give a final answer, then right, I'm free to say what I want.
One of the things that interests me about history is that if you start thinking about how history is usually written, the it's enormously complicated. If you took one simple single event and tried to track down everything, I think it would be physically impossible to do it.
Totally so.
And if you one of the things that I've thoroughly enjoyed about War to End All War, and don't want to talk about that because I want to ask you about your latest story too. I'm just fascinated with it. Um, most of the history that we get is sanitized in some ways. You
All of it is sanitized.
Because I remember you are no fan of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. And
Not at all. Butcher Haig is one of the vilest characters of 20th century history. He was more concerned to run a war against the British working class than against the Germans. His determination was at the end of the war, nothing would have changed. The social structure would have been preserved. And if that meant he had to kill off 1 million of his own soldiers, he did not care in the slightest. Add to that, there's his personal point of view that the price of a battle was death. His own soldiers must die in any battle, that's inevitable. Therefore, you can argue that the more soldiers have died, the more valuable that battle must have been. He often saw high casualty lists as a positive, as something to prove that his army had fought well. And that's such a corrupt point of view.
To me, now I've never been in the military, but I've studied military history most of my life, and especially the last 10 or 15 years. And my feeling is that, well, it's a matter of simple logistics. You want to keep your men alive because if they're dead, they're not useful. And
Exactly.
and if you've wasted all that training and material, it's to no end. Uh, I don't know. See, in World War One, to read about World War One, I have to be in a certain frame of mind because otherwise I get really angry, my blood pressure goes up, and my doctor says that's very bad for me.
Same here. World War One is unbelievable in the sheer neglect of common sense. You're right. If you want to win a war, you've got to have an army. If you've just killed your army off, then how can you win? Except that in the trenches, it was a fairly good bet that if you lost one of your men, then the enemy was losing one of his men. And by 1917, the Allied forces, with the aid of America, outnumbered the German forces by at least 2 million. So if they just killed one for one, at the end of 3 years killing, there'd be 2 million Allies left and 0 Germans left. So you didn't have to worry about anything else, just get going.
Okay, I got to tell you what just popped into my head when you said that. I've been, for different reasons, researching the history of the idea of strategic bombardment and precision strategic bombardment, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I ran across was a quote from a general named Thomas Powers, who took over the Strategic Air Command from Curtis E. LeMay. And his point of view was that if there was a nuclear war and there were no Russians left and one American left, then we'd won.
Yes,
And that sort of sounds like the same mindset.
it is. It's identical mindset, and it's appalling, isn't it? But
Well, I,
on the other hand, it depends on your enemy. At the
but to
moment, we have Putin who seems to believe that. So where do we stand?
me, the thing that always got to me is I remember when we lived close to an Air Force base where there was a wing of B-52 bombers. And
Mhm.
those things would come over the house and shake the house, and I was
Yeah.
just old enough to have read a little bit about, well, nuclear energy more because I wanted to be a scientist originally. And necessarily that lets you know a little bit about what atomic weapons can do or nuclear weapons. And I was scared to death. I wouldn't hid under my parents' bed. I'm not ashamed to say it. Needless to say, when I wasn't blown to kingdom come, I was very relieved, but it's left me with this whole thing of I don't understand the what possible point that could have, and I don't understand what possible point Haig could have. It's almost like there is that same mindset, and we're getting a little far afield here because it's an interesting idea. To as writers, we got to be part psychologists too.
Yes, what makes people tick? How do you create characters who are realistic? And how
Yes.
do you create characters that you like and allow them to do things you dislike? That's a major problem.
Well, I economic history. Can you tell me a little bit about what that exactly entails?
Economic history, essentially, how and why the way we make our living changed so very much. Obviously, from an English point of view, where the changes came so very suddenly and yet were well documented, it's fascinating. 1775, Britain was an agricultural country primarily. 1785, 25% of the population was working in industry. So you're looking at 10 years and this sudden, massive, out of nowhere change, and documented and needing explanation. What happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? It's taken us a lot of time to accept that it did happen, and it's crazy stuff. Why did people suddenly start digging those seams of coal? They're out on the surface, they've been there forever. People, you would take perhaps a ton a year from a local open cast coal seam and keep the fires going. And then suddenly, next year, they took 100 tons, and the year after that, they took 10,000 tons. Why?
How much of that had to do with the introduction of steel making, though?
Steel making, iron and steel, the changes were there. And yet, if you look at it, Abraham Darby was working on the Severn as early as 1750. And they were pottering with new means of making iron and a tiny bit of steel. And then suddenly, 40 odd years later, there's the explosion from perhaps 1,000 tons of steel in a year, 10,000 tons. And then 10 years later, we're looking at least 500,000 tons of iron and perhaps 100 tons of steel itself. Huge changes.
As a historical process in and of itself, that's suddenly you have the opportunity of building ships of steel rather than wood.
Yeah.
And that in itself, then you've got wow.
It's a huge set of changes, and the population changes that went with it. 1785, 2/3 of the population of Great Britain live in the South Midlands down to the south coast. 1805, 2/3 of the population live in the North Midlands up to the north of England. So roughly 1/3 of the population had actually physically shifted 100, 150, 200 miles.
Now that's interesting because in this country you saw a similar shift, but it wasn't until the 20th century.
Yeah.
You had I forget what the exact figures are, but the great majority of people were engaged in agricultural pursuits before World War One. Then between the end of World War One and 1950, say, it flip-flopped. It was almost the exact opposite.
Yes. But
And
over 2 generations at least. The
yes,
English happened in, the bulk of it happened in 20 years. And that's why you've got so much massive change. Fascinating to see why.
well, again, one of the things about Haig, he was a cavalryman,
Yep.
and that whole notion. I'm a I used to enjoy fencing when I was younger. Um, but on the other hand, my grandfather taught me to shoot when I was even younger than that.
Yep.
So edged weapons I can understand, but the whole notion of charging into machine guns with a saber,
It was the
that
morally correct thing to do. The saber was the gentleman's weapon, and the gentleman was the superior soldier. Therefore, the gentleman using his own weapon must achieve victory. End of story. Simple common sense. Nah, what's that got to do with it?
I don't know. Maybe it's
It was a question of belief. The saber was morally right. So,
I
use the
don't know
saber.
if you can see it, but hang on a sec. I couldn't resist buying this when I found it in a war surplus shop.
Yeah.
This is actually the last saber used by the U.S. cavalry. It was
Mm,
designed in 1914 by Lieutenant
19
George S. Patton Jr.
You're joking. As late as that?
Yep. In fact, the last cavalry charge that I'm aware of took place in the Philippines, I think in February of 1942. It was a unique tactical situation, and the what was that regiment? I want to say it was the 22nd Regiment, Cavalry Regiment. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and make sure of it. But there was a cavalry regiment that was headquartered in the Philippines, and it was actually headquartered right next to Clark Airfield at Fort Stotzenberg. Um, these guys just had a favorable tactical situation. They charged the Japanese on their horses, but I'm pretty sure that was the last time that ever happened, and it was just a unique set of events. Otherwise, they wouldn't have even tried it.
Yeah, the British had actually given up on the horse by then. The last cavalry regiment took to armored cars in 1938. After a long fight, a lot of argument against it.
We had a cavalry division in along the Mexican border. I think it was the second division, and they used horses right up until World War II.
Mm.
Now, of course, they were dismounted pretty shortly after the war started.
Yeah.
But and I guess in a way I could understand at that time how the horse might have been a better means of patrolling a frontier like that. Maybe. But
In the
you had
absence,
airplanes. Why not
yes.
use airplanes?
Oh, well, they didn't belong to the cavalrymen. In the absence of roads along a desert frontier, I suppose you can argue for the horse. I can't say as I'd want to be the man riding that horse.
Um, I I I was married to a girl one time who was an equestrian. I never learned how to ride, but I shoveled a lot of bucolic byproduct because we had our own stables. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I know all about that sort of it. I know that end of it really well. Well, let me ask you this. Do you feel at this time, I'm trying to get some feel for the sort of research you do. Do you have a big print library or do you rely on the internet? What
I,
do you tend to do?
I suppose I've got a couple of thousand books tucked away around my workrooms,
Mm-hmm.
which provide the basics. For detail, absolute minor detail, then I use the internet. As an example, a couple of weeks back, I needed to discover just how big the hammocks were that were used on the C-class submarines in 1914.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't find anything in any of the standard textbooks. So I went online. Within 10 minutes, I discovered that the hammocks used on the C-class submarines were about 6 inches shorter than the standard Royal Naval issue. And that was something I needed to know because there was just no space to put the number of people who were sleeping without those hammocks being smaller, which meant they had to have smaller men to fit inside them. So it actually changed the perception of the crews of the submarines.
That I think brings up a really important point about historical fiction. Just that one little detail. It on the surface, it sounds a little bit, who cares? On the other hand, if you're a sailor in one of those C-class submarines and you're having to do, I'm 6'2". If I had to fit into a bunk that was 5'6", buddy, I'm not sure there'd be any way.
Exactly.
I'd be one uncomfortable sailor. They'd probably put me on a different kind of ship.
Yeah. In the end, if you look at the photographs of the time, most other ranks were short men.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, they picked them out and persuaded them. They're all volunteers, but they could be persuaded to volunteer, I suspect. And smaller men generally ended up in the submarines. They weren't popular on the battleships, smaller men, because they made the ranks look uneven. And battleships were all about being smart.
What was that about I think in one of your books, you mentioned something about the Coldstream Guards had to be tall guys,
Yep.
at least the other ranks.
The Coldstream Guards, if you weren't 6 foot tall, you didn't get into the Guards. They used to recruit down in Dorset every year because Dorset is one of the tallest counties in England. And the Brigade of Guards would send its recruiting parties through all the villages, picking out the lads who are of a decent height and persuading them they really wanted to join up. Look what you'd be in a bearskin parading in front of your king at Buckingham Palace. And the country boys would all sign on and go off for their 8 or 10 years. Guardsmen were to a penny down in Dorset, ex-guardsmen, because they had to be of a height. The same as the Rifle Brigade went the other way. They looked for little men. It's fascinating stuff, the way it goes. The Durham Light Infantry would be another example. They took coal miners who are always short. So
I saw a picture the other day of I think it was Welsh coal miners. I won't guarantee that. This was 1920 or thereabouts, may have been pre-war. And it was an elevator car. It had 2 levels, and these guys were literally stacked in there like sardines. And I don't think they could have been much more than 5 foot, 5'2". Not any of them.
that's reasonable. The
Um,
average height in South Wales is still lower than the average for the rest of the United Kingdom.
huh,
Because if you were tall, you didn't get down the mines. If you didn't get
yeah.
down the mines in South Wales, then you virtually had to leave the area to find work. So only the short people were left breeding with each other.
A little bit of Darwin in action.
Yeah, unfortunately so. But yeah, those double-decker cages going down the mines, they're appalling things, aren't they? Absolutely horrifying.
Uh,
Um,
I I myself am not really fond of small enclosed spaces, and the idea of that much dirt on top of me held held from collapsing only by the questionable ingenuity of people who were putting timbers in at the lowest bid. Uh, not sure I
exactly.
not sure I care for that.
If you have a quick look at the death rates, then I definitely didn't care for it. There's
Well, but
something,
again, that shows the necessity of research and actually the joy of the research in this kind of thing, because you find out, oh, well, this is why that happened. This is why that was necessary.
yeah. And coal mining, something I've never been able to understand because I don't think I could do it. I'm pretty certain that if I was in a coal mining village brought up there, then by the time I was 15, I'd be legging it down the road. I would be off to another part of the country. I could not go down the mines. And why so many tens of thousands did, just accepted it, I cannot comprehend, can't understand.
I uh I worked for a firm up in West Virginia, which is coal country here in the
Yeah,
States. And it's an interesting mentality. I won't pretend to understand it myself. Um, but I suppose it's like almost anything. If that's what you grow up to accept, um, you
it's
accept it.
normal.
Yeah.
Yep, if it's normal, it's normal, but
Yeah.
it's strange.
So as historical fiction writers, so how would we even approach that? I mean, I can't imagine a book set. I can't imagine that I would write a book set in the coal mine simply
Not at
because it
all.
scares the heck out of me.
Same here. I've never been down a coal mine, and if I haven't been down a coal mine, I really shouldn't be writing about it.
Yeah.
What I have not had some experience of, even if it's secondhand, I really tend to avoid.
What do you, that brings up an interesting point though. In terms of personal skills or accomplishments or experiences, to what uh, to what extent do you think that the historical fiction writer should pursue? Say, for example, I write almost exclusive aviation stories, but off and on, I've flown all my life. You know, I'm not a pilot, but I've been around aviation and aviators, and I have a certain amount of flying experience.
Yeah,
But to what extent should you be? Yeah, I guess it just depends on the individual.
you have to have a degree of experience. In my case, I was helped by a brother who was a professional soldier and had the attitude of the soldier, the mindset of the soldier, which ain't the same as civilian people have at all. And a cousin who was chief petty officer on submarines. Again, there's quite an amount of feeling of how that sort of person thinks. Going back, I was born obviously immediately after the Second War, and it was still a major conversational background through the 50s and 60s. Just walking down the road, for example, was southern England near Southampton, and it was a commonplace to walk down the road, kick something there, and get a couple of dozen cartridge cases dropped from the planes shooting overhead. That's a point they never mention, of course, with the air battles of the early 40s. They were dropping their cartridges straight out of the wings. So they
Yeah.
were coming down by the thousands, rattling on the roofs and on the people underneath. It was comments were often quite offensive. People who are bitterly upset, the baby's out sleeping, and all of a sudden there's a dozen hot, empty cartridge cases just come down and landed on the pram.
When we lived in the Marshall Islands, there was a battle fought there during World War II.
Yeah,
And you could go, you know, our house that we lived in was right on the beach, and you could go out on the reef at low tide. And I had um, like a shoebox full just of shrapnel or bullet cores. It was amazing what you could still find. Um, One time I found an unexploded 6-inch shell, which was a bit of a thrill, as you can well imagine. So yeah, I know what you're talking about there, not from personal well, other than that. Uh, and there was, of course, across the lagoon from us, the wreck of the Prinz Eugen that they used as a target ship during the nuclear testing.
yeah,
And it was just a common place for us to, you know, I like to go and watch the sunset. Well, where I watched the sunset, Prinz Eugen was directly in line with
yeah.
the sunset. So you and I imagine in England you were much more surrounded by reminders of both wars.
Yes. The Second War, much more than the first. The First World War was a traditional war fought mainly in France.
Mhm.
And, the Second World War is the first British war that was actually fought over British territory. Prior to that, all of our wars were fought overseas and were distanced from the people. It made a surprising difference of attitude. One of my uncle's father's oldest brother joined up 1910 and went out to India, came back 1918, missed most of the First World War, lucky man. But that was typical of the British soldier. He did his soldiering overseas, and the wars were all fought at a distance. You read about a war, you didn't take part in it. So the Second World War was fundamentally different to any war that had been previously. It actually took place within sight of the people of Britain.
Well, if you lived on the shore, or of the shore of the English Channel, I imagine you could see the war on your doorstep.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. So intriguing stuff. I spent a couple of years near Rabaul in East New Britain at Kokopo. And Rabaul was bombed every day from 1942 to the end of the war, literally every day. And the amount of unexploded ordnance was incredible, absolutely incredible.
Well, Rabaul is a place I learned a good bit about. Um, I would love sometime to be able to see it. I don't think that's in the cards now, but
Probably
most
not.
most of the
Stu-
town got buried in a volcanic eruption a few years back, didn't it?
Yep, there was one quite recently, 97, I think it was,
Yeah, yeah.
which was another major. 47, there was a big one, another one in the 30s, 1947. Then a really big one, I think it was 97, which changed the landscape substantially. I haven't been back since then, but Rabaul was a fascinating place to live. The Gazelle Peninsula, it was the right at the end of the colonial era. I was there. There were still plantations. There were still plantation owners. There was still the way of life down at the club, drink a damn sight too much, thoroughly enjoy oneself, go out fishing, and then onto the plantation, collect the cocoa bean, deal with the copra, get back, have a drink, perhaps do a little bit more work and have another drink, and a hell of a life. It was fascinating stuff. Somerset Maugham would have recognized it immediately. I've always felt privileged to have just been there at that last final kick of colonialism.
They did you work for the Australian government at that
No,
time?
I worked for the government of Papua New Guinea. They'd literally
Okay,
just become independent,
okay, okay.
was why it was ending.
Well, I remember that the provenance, one of the reasons pigeon has German words is the Germans used to own those islands.
Yep.
And then the English took them over, but it was mostly the Australians, right? That ran the islands.
Yeah. Yeah. It was actually the Australians who conquered the German colony,
Mhm.
so that New Guinea was the only example in the world of a colony of a colony. And it was intriguing stuff. It's a wonderful place to be for a short time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did you ever get up on the Kokoda track?
Yes, I was at, for the last year I was there, I was at Sagari High School as a teacher. And Sagari High School is up at the bottom of the Astrolabe Mountains and literally where the Kokoda track takes off. So yeah, I was at the bottom of the Kokoda track for nearly a year. Fascinating place to be.
I can't imagine. I read a lot about that campaign at one point, and it's to write it all, you have to have a certain amount of imagination. You've got to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the people you're reading about, and try to imagine what they must have gone through. But good Lord.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, intriguing stuff. There's still local men who had worked as carriers there, very old by that time, but still had things to say about it and comments on the various warriors they observed. It was most intriguing. I'm afraid their comments on American officers were not polite. Generally speaking, American soldiers, wonderful fighting men. American officers, oh, forget it.
Well, you're not going to teach that kind of thing in 90 days, despite what everybody wants you to think.
No.
I don't know. I've always wondered, one of the things that I liked about your characters very much is that whole idea that the officer is there to look after his men. And I really just liked that, because to me that well, you can probably tell I agreed with that 210%.
Yeah, it's the best of officers realize that in fact they've got nothing to do. Their job is to make sure that the men who do the actual fighting are put into the right place to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And good officers, and there's a lot of them about, are totally concerned for their men. Bad officers are generally found with a bullet in the back from their men. And it's quite amazing how many of them there are. If you talk to the remaining veterans, you look at the reports which are not published, and I've managed to get hold of a very few. I can't mention them too publicly because I shouldn't have them, but they're talking on some campaigns of a 10% of officer casualties being bullets in the back.
Great day.
That's huge, isn't it?
I, but see, that's an interesting psychological idea. Look at the private soldier who probably doesn't really want to be there in the first place, but he's willing, despite that. But if you get some officer who's going to act like a horse's patoot, shall we say, uh, I can understand how he might encounter an unfortunate accident
That's
with
it.
bullets flying about.
Yep. You can do it in the peacetime army. You cannot do it in the wartime army, and too many of them didn't notice that fact. And I know it was publicized in the Vietnam War, fragging the officers attained quite an amount of publicity, as if it was something new, as if it had never happened before. The
Well,
only difference was lots of journalists in Vietnam.
well, us Yanks, we have this what's the word I want here? This tendency towards naive innocence, maybe. Um, Almost like we don't learn very much over the years. I hate to say that, but it does seem like we have to relearn lessons every time, just about every time. Um,
Yes, unfortunately so. The British have learned one or two. Mostly the result of that has been to give up on being soldiers. Our army is now so small that it can effectively be forgotten about.
if I remember, Great Britain now has essentially a brigade of tanks. Is that correct?
A thin brigade of tanks.
I mean, they're good tanks from everything that I hear, but
Yeah, they're quite good tanks. It's just that by the third day of battle, there won't be any left.
well, as the Soviets used to say, quantity is a quality.
Agreed, wholly agreed. The same, the Ukrainians have complained that we are not offering them much in the way of weaponry and ammunition. The reason's simple, we haven't got it.
Well, I know that one of the things that's been put forward as a rationale for arming the Ukrainians out of our stocks is a lot of it is stuff that we were on the point of destroying anyway.
Yep.
So it makes more sense to let them do something useful with it than than it does to destroy it with probable environmental complications.
Yes, I wholly agree. Plus the fact if the Ukrainians can kill a few Russians that we don't have to eventually, well and good.
You know, I have two good friends here in Hickory who are Russian expats. And all
Mhm.
you got to do to get a sour look on their face is say Putin, and and one of them will go, and the other one just kind of shakes his head.
Yep. It's the
So,
chance of the war is higher than it's ever been, I suspect.
well, the thing that puzzles me. Okay, look, I'm about to get on my political soapbox, and I ain't doing it
No,
because
we're dealing with economic history.
right, right. Well, you know, in a sense, it is economic history because nothing says economics like blowing up things. You
Yep.
just it's
There's a strong argument can be put forward that blowing up things is a very good idea if the economy is down, because you've got to replace them. And that makes work for the factories.
You know, I will say one thing that I hadn't actually thought about, but you made me think about in End of All Wars. I was thinking about battleships, and I never could understand why the Royal Navy just kept them sitting up there at Scapa Flow for the whole duration of it. Then I thought, you know, Andrew's right. If they get blown up, then you know it's you've been proven wrong in a most spectacular manner.
It'd be a disaster to have lost the battleships. Not that they're any use from an actual military point of view, but they'd all cost several millions, which at that time was an awful lot of money.
Oh, sure.
And they'd all had hundreds, thousands of photographs taken of them, the wonderful steel castles. You lose one of them and you've lost a part of British heritage. They had to be protected. And the other point, of course, is they couldn't do anything anyway.
Well, I if I hadn't been a aviation oriented, I really enjoy Navy stories. Um,
Hmm.
and a lot of the guys I volunteer at an air museum here in Hickory, and a lot of the guys in it are Navy veterans. Um, we have one of the only P3 Orions that you can actually still go inside, and it's
Yeah,
more or less intact with all the, I mean, it's all obsolete now, of course, but it's all the sub hunting gear that you would have wanted back in the 1990s.
yeah.
Uh, it's interesting to talk to these guys and get their points of view. It's like you said about your brother, was it, who was in the Navy?
A cousin in the Navy.
Cousin in the Navy. Yeah, it's a totally different point of view, totally different mindset.
Absolutely.
And if you're going to write about that, then you need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, yeah. The naval point of view. Okay, I come from a naval area, not so far from Portsmouth, close to Southampton. Always there's shipping in the background. And all the time, somebody I'd been to school with was just going into the Navy, leaving the Navy, considering joining. It was always part of the background. And the Navy thinks differently to ordinary people. They're not ordinary people.
Uh,
Peculiar.
I imagine that when your world is bounded by steel or wooden walls, so to speak, and that's all that's between you and a watery grave, not to be too dramatic about it, that it does engender a totally different mindset.
Yeah.
You
Plus the fact you're in a little village, totally isolated.
mhm.
And everyone knows that villages are most peculiar places.
You know,
Amazing things there.
well, I've always wondered what it would be like to actually live in a small town. We lived in a relatively small town when I was born, but we moved away almost instantly. And again, these are experiences that you kind of have to have
Yeah.
if you're going to write about it. And I'm not sure what I would write about if I had to write about a small village. I think I'd have to go and read some old English novels or something.
Mhm. We're in a small village. Oomph. What do you write about? Incest seems to be one of the basic forms of entertainment in most small villages. They're peculiar, closed, nasty little places generally. Because you've only got a very, very few contacts, you either love them or hate them, and there ain't much in between, and they can be vicious little places. People who look at the wonderful pastoral agricultural life, they don't see the reality of the backbiting and the knife stabbing that goes on there. Awful places villages can be.
Now you bring up an interesting point that writers also need to be good observers.
All the time.
And that's what you just said brings that home to me. Um, so I would recommend that if you want to be a writer, the first thing you got to do is be aware of your surroundings and why things are happening.
Yeah, you've got to see people. Normally in a town, you don't see people. You pass by thousands of them, but you don't see them. You keep yourself distant from all these strangers who are going by. The writer has got to be involved with every one of them. You've got to look at those faces and wonder with each one, why is he scowling? Why is she smiling? Is that poor bugger as miserable as he actually is? Why? Why? What's behind them? What's the story? You can invent stories for every one of them. They're wrong mostly, but they're good stories.
You might not write about it necessarily, except in your own head.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see your point. Well, let me ask you a question. If you were going to advise a young writer starting out, what would your advice to the young writer be, other than stay away from it and don't get involved unless you really love it?
First of all, learn the tools of the trade.
Mhm.
If you were going to be a carpenter, you'd learn how to use a hammer and nails and whatever. If you're going to be a writer, you'd better learn how to use English.
Mhm.
Make sure you can actually write a sentence and that it says what you want it to. After all, we're in a complex trade writing. I think an idea, I write it onto the book. The person who reads it should end up with exactly the same idea in their head. That degree of communication takes a lot of doing and a lot of command and control with language. And if you can't control your language, you can't write.
Yes, I like that. I like that. You've either got to be able to do it as a sort of gestalt because you've read so many good books that you sort of absorb it.
Yep.
But even then, you have to be able to look at what you've written and say, does this actually mean what I want it to mean?
Yep.
And sometimes that takes a degree of self-perception, self-honesty, maybe. Uh, that can be hard to do.
Yep.
It's
Go back to Dr. Seuss. I said what I meant and I meant what I said.
well, there you are.
And that's perfectly encapsulates what writing is about. You've got to have the tools of language. Having once gained those tools of language, use them. And always remember you're the author, you're right.
I like that. You're the author. You're right. But you'd better know what you're doing.
Well, yeah, it helps if you know what you're doing, but even so, it's my book. and what's in it is mine. So you've got to be brave enough to turn around and say, this is what I believe to be the facts are. Because I believe it, that's what I'm saying. And I'm going to say it as clearly and precisely and accurately as I can. Commitment.
You know, it's interesting. You write for a long time and you think you know things, and then you realize you hadn't exactly put it in stone, so to speak. Things that you've been doing, but you just didn't realize you were doing it. It's ever so much better to actually have an awareness of that.
Yeah. I
Okay,
think, yeah.
Andrew, we've been at this for about an hour.
Okay.
If you could give one piece of advice to the historical fiction writer other than write a good sentence and say exactly what you mean to say, what would it be?
Tell the story you love. If you don't like the story, why should anybody else like it?
Yeah, because it isn't going to be a good story if you don't love it.
That's right.
That's right. Okay. On that note, Andrew, thank you so much for speaking with us today. And I wish you, what are you going to write next? You say you just finished a story. So what's next?
I think I start Billy Bacon fifth book tomorrow morning. I'm pretty much certain tonight that's what I'm doing tomorrow.
Okay.
Tomorrow morning after breakfast, I shall certainly start writing another book.
I'll tell you what, you're an inspiration to me, pal. I feel exactly the way you do. As long as I can keep going, I'm going to keep writing. So, so thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. And if you hang on just one second,
Mhm.
let's see. I've got, don't want that one. Ah, here we go. This gets into the whole technology thing. How do I shut this down?
You and me both.
Oh, here we are. It says right there, pause